June 9th, 1944, 13:47 hours, 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, private first class. Danny Sullivan died in Corporal Jack Hayes' arms in exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and Hayes counted every second while watching blood pump from Sullivan's severed femoral artery at a rate of approximately 500 milliliters per minute, which meant Sullivan had maybe 8 minutes total before hemorrhagic shock shut down his brain, and 10 minutes before his heart stopped trying to pump blood that was no longer inside his body. Hayes had been a combat medic for the 29th Infantry Division for 3 days. D-Day plus 3. And he'd already watched 14 men bleed out from arterial wounds because the only treatment available was pressure bandages that couldn't stop arterial bleeding and tourniquets that worked on limbs but were useless on torso or groin wounds where the major arteries ran too deep to compress. Sullivan had taken shrapnel from a German 82 mm artillery shell that hit 20 feet from his position in the Norman hedgerow at 13:43 hours. The explosion threw him 8 feet backward and embedded a 3-inch fragment of steel casing into his upper left thigh, severing the femoral artery approximately 4 inches below the inguinal ligament. Hayes reached him at 13:44 hours, tore open Sullivan's uniform, saw the wound, and knew immediately that Sullivan was going to die. The blood wasn't seeping or flowing. It was spurting, pulsing with each heartbeat, bright arterial red, shooting 6 inches into the air in rhythmic jets that followed Sullivan's pulse rate of 140 beats per minute as his body tried desperately to maintain blood pressure while bleeding out. Hayes pressed both hands over the wound, applying direct pressure the way they'd taught him in field medic training at Camp Breckenridge. Sullivan screamed. Not words, just sound, high-pitched and continuous, the sound humans make when pain overwhelms every other sensation. Hayes pressed harder, feeling the artery pulse beneath his hands, feeling Sullivan's blood running hot between his fingers and soaking his uniform sleeves. "Stay with me, Danny. Stay with me. You're going to be okay." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. The nearest field hospital was 3 miles back at the beach, a 20-minute ambulance ride over roads that were cratered by German artillery and clogged with supply trucks. Sullivan wouldn't survive 20 minutes. He might not survive 10. Hayes had stuffed 4 pressure bandages into the wound in the first 30 seconds, packing them tight against the torn artery, trying to create enough external pressure to collapse the vessel and stop the bleeding. It didn't work. Standard Army field dressings, cotton gauze rolls treated with sulfa powder, were designed for capillary bleeding and small vessel injuries, not for major arterial trauma. The blood soaked through the first bandage in 15 seconds, through the second in 20 seconds. By the third bandage, Hayes' hands were covered in blood up to his wrists, slippery and warm, and Sullivan's face was turning pale. Not the healthy pink of someone who had enough oxygen in their blood, but the waxy white of someone entering hypovolemic shock. Sullivan looked up at Hayes with eyes that were starting to lose focus. "Am I going to die, Doc?" His voice was weak, breathy, starting to slur as his blood pressure dropped and his brain stopped getting enough oxygen. Combat medics weren't doctors. Hayes had 8 weeks of training, not 8 years of medical school. But the wounded always called them doc because doctors were the people who saved lives, and medics were all they had. "You're not going to die," Hayes said, knowing it was a lie, maintaining pressure on a wound that was still bleeding despite 4 bandages and 180 seconds of direct pressure. "You're going to make it home to Boston, going to see your girl. What's her name again?" "Catherine." Sullivan's lips were turning blue. "We were supposed to get married, July. She picked out a dress. White, with lace." His words were coming slower, spaces between them getting longer as his brain struggled with oxygen deprivation. "Tell her I love her. Tell her I tried to come home." "You tell her yourself when you get back." Hayes pressed harder on the wound, applying enough force that he could feel his hand muscles cramping, his fingers going numb. Blood continued pulsing through the bandages. Sullivan's pulse rate was climbing, 150 beats per minute now, his heart working harder to compensate for falling blood pressure, accelerating the blood loss in a vicious cycle that always ended the same way. Hayes had seen this 14 times already. He knew how it ended. "Stay with me, Danny. Don't you close your eyes. Look at me. Tell me more about Catherine." Sullivan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes rolled back, showing white. His breathing became shallow, rapid, ineffective, 40 breaths per minute, but only moving small amounts of air because his blood pressure had dropped so low that his lungs couldn't expand properly. At 13:46 hours and 30 seconds, his pulse became thready and irregular, the kind of pulse you get when the heart is running out of blood to pump and starting to fibrillate. At 13:47 hours and 17 seconds, his heart stopped. His chest stopped moving. The blood stopped pulsing from his wound because there was no more blood pressure to drive it. Private First Class Danny Sullivan, 22 years old from South Boston, engaged to Catherine Murphy, who'd picked out a white dress with lace for a July wedding that would never happen, was dead from a wound that wouldn't have killed him if Hayes had been able to stop the arterial bleeding. Hayes sat back on his heels, his hands covered in Sullivan's blood, and stared at the body in front of him. This was the 15th man he'd watched bleed out from arterial trauma in 3 days. 15 men who'd survived D-Day, survived the landing at Omaha Beach, survived German machine gun fire and mortars and artillery, only to die from wounds that should have been survivable if there was a way to stop arterial bleeding in the field. Pressure bandages didn't work. He'd just proven that for the 15th time. Tourniquets didn't work on torso or groin wounds where you couldn't isolate the limb. The only treatment that worked for severed arteries was surgical clamping and ligation, which required an operating room and a surgeon and equipment that wasn't available 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, where German artillery was still falling, and the nearest field hospital was 20 minutes away by ambulance. Corporal Jack Hayes was 26 years old, from Chicago, former emergency medical technician for Cook County Hospital, before the draft board decided his medical experience would be more useful in Europe than on Chicago's South Side. He'd spent 4 years responding to car accidents, industrial injuries, gunshot wounds, stabbings, trauma cases where people bled, and you had maybe 10 minutes to stabilize them before transport. He'd learned to think fast, improvise with limited equipment, do whatever it took to keep people alive until they reached the hospital. That experience had taught him something that Army field medic training hadn't emphasized. The first few minutes of trauma care determined whether patients lived or died, and the most common cause of preventable death was uncontrolled hemorrhage. Standard Army doctrine said medics should apply pressure bandages to bleeding wounds, administer morphine for pain, and evacuate casualties to field hospitals as quickly as possible. That doctrine worked fine for minor injuries and stable casualties. It failed completely for arterial bleeding that killed in 4 to 6 minutes, faster than evacuation could happen, faster than help could arrive. Hayes had watched 15 men die because doctrine said pressure bandages were the solution, and doctrine was wrong. He looked at his hands, covered in Sullivan's blood, and something crystallized in his mind. Pressure bandages didn't work because they compressed the tissue around the artery without actually clamping the vessel itself. The artery continued pulsing underneath the bandages, blood continued flowing through the gap in the vessel wall, and all the external pressure in the world couldn't seal a 3-millimeter hole in a pressurized pipe that was pumping 5 liters of blood per minute at 120 millimeters of mercury. What Hayes needed wasn't external pressure. He needed direct mechanical compression of the vessel, something that could clamp the artery shut above the injury site, stopping blood flow completely until surgery could repair the damage. Surgeons did this routinely in operating rooms using hemostatic clamps, specialized forceps with serrated jaws that could grip blood vessels without crushing them, held shut by locking mechanisms that maintained constant pressure. Hayes had watched vascular surgeons at Cook County Hospital clamp arteries dozens of times during trauma surgeries, seen how effectively the clamps stopped bleeding, seen how patients who would have bled to death survived because someone got control of the artery in the first few minutes. But hemostatic clamps required sterile operating rooms and surgical teams and equipment that didn't exist in Norman hedgerows 3 miles from Omaha Beach, where German artillery was still falling. Unless Hayes could improvise something that did the same job with materials he had access to in the field. He stood up, looking around the hedgerow position where his unit had established a temporary aid station. 20 wounded men on stretchers waiting for ambulance evacuation. 3 other medics working frantically to stabilize casualties, applying tourniquets to mangled limbs, administering morphine, bandaging wounds that weren't immediately life-threatening. Artillery shells continued falling 400 yards to the east, German 88s firing blind at suspected American positions. Small arms fire crackled in the distance. This was D-Day +3, and the battle for Normandy was far from over. Hayes's medical kit contained the standard field medic issue: pressure bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, surgical tape, scissors, forceps, a tourniquet, and assorted minor supplies. The forceps were small, designed for removing debris from wounds and holding bandages in place. 6-inch-long Kelly forceps with straight jaws and a locking mechanism. Not designed for clamping arteries. Too small, wrong shape, insufficient grip strength. But the locking mechanism worked on the same principle as surgical clamps. Squeeze the handles together, the ratchet engaged, maintaining constant pressure without requiring continuous hand force. What Hayes needed was a way to apply that locking force to an artery buried 2 inches deep in tissue. Direct finger pressure worked temporarily, but required constant attention and both hands, which meant he couldn't treat other casualties. Standard forceps were too short to reach deep vessels and too weak to maintain arterial compression for extended periods. But if Hayes could extend the forceps, increase their reach and mechanical advantage, maybe create a tool that could clamp deep arteries from inside the wound. He looked at Sullivan's body, at the wound still slowly oozing blood now that the heart had stopped pumping, at the 4 pressure bandages soaked through with blood, at the space between the skin and the artery where 2 inches of tissue separated external pressure from internal vessel. And an idea started forming. Crazy, improvised, probably violating every Army medical regulation and surgical protocol, but possibly the difference between watching more men bleed to death and actually saving some of them. The medical supply truck was parked 50 yards behind the hedgerow, guarded by Private Morrison, who was supposed to be distributing supplies, but was currently hiding behind the truck smoking a cigarette while German artillery shells fell in the distance. Hayes found him there and grabbed what he needed without asking permission, because permission would mean explaining his idea to officers who would say it was unauthorized and dangerous and required proper testing and approval, which would take weeks, during which dozens more soldiers would bleed to death from arterial wounds. He grabbed 1 roll of 16-gauge steel wire, the kind used for securing equipment and closing incision sites during field surgery. 1 length of rubber surgical tubing, 1/4-inch diameter, used for improvised tourniquets and fluid drainage. 2 additional Kelly forceps from the spare equipment box. 1 tube of petroleum jelly. Scissors, tape, and a small vice grip that mechanics used for vehicle repairs, but which happened to be exactly the right size for his purposes. Total cost of materials, approximately 35 cents. Total time to assemble, 15 minutes if he worked fast and didn't overthink it. Hayes sat down behind the medical supply truck and started fabricating what he was already thinking of as an emergency arterial clamp. The concept was simple. Extend the reach of Kelly forceps by attaching rigid wire shafts that could penetrate deep into wounds and reach buried arteries. Create a mechanical advantage using the locking forceps mechanism to maintain compression. Protect the artery from crushing damage by wrapping the wire tips with rubber tubing that would distribute pressure over a larger surface area. He cut 2 8-inch lengths of steel wire and bent the last inch of each into a gentle curve. Not a sharp hook that would tear tissue, but a smooth arc that could slide around a blood vessel. He wrapped the curved sections with 1/4-inch rubber surgical tubing, securing it with tape, creating padded contact surfaces that would compress the artery without damaging it. Then he attached the wire shafts to the Kelly forceps handles using the vice grip, positioning the wires so they extended forward like elongated jaws, maintaining the forceps locking mechanism while increasing the reach from 6 inches to 14 inches. The finished device looked ridiculous, a Frankenstein's monster of medical equipment cobbled together from spare parts and mechanics tools. But Hayes tested the mechanism, and it worked. Squeeze the forceps handles together. The steel wire jaws closed around a wooden stick that approximated an artery's diameter, the rubber padding distributed pressure evenly, and the locking ratchet held the compression without requiring continuous hand force. Release the lock, the jaws opened, allowing removal without tissue damage. The entire device weighed maybe 4 ounces and could be sterilized with alcohol or boiling water. Hayes needed to test it on an actual arterial wound. He needed to find out if his improvised clamp could do what pressure bandages couldn't: stop arterial bleeding in the field and keep casualties alive long enough to reach surgical care. And he had maybe 2 hours before the next German artillery barrage would create more arterial wounds and more opportunities for men to bleed to death, while Hayes watched helplessly with pressure bandages that didn't work. At 14:23 hours, the German 88s started firing again. 8 shells fell in a line across the hedgerow positions 300 yards east of Hayes's aid station. He heard the impacts, heard the screams, grabbed his medical kit and his improvised arterial clamp, and ran toward the sound. This was either going to work, or he was going to watch more men die. But at least this time he'd be trying something different than pressure bandages that failed every time arterial bleeding started. Private Jenkins took shrapnel from the 3rd shell, caught it in the right upper thigh, went down screaming with bright red blood pulsing from a wound that Hayes recognized immediately as a severed femoral artery. Hayes reached him at 14:24 hours and 30 seconds. Jenkins was conscious, terrified, bleeding at a rate that gave him maybe 5 minutes before shock. Hayes tore open Jenkins' uniform, located the wound, 3-inch gash, deep, bright arterial blood spurting with each heartbeat. "Listen to me," Hayes said, his voice calm despite adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm going to stop the bleeding. You're going to be okay. Stay calm." He didn't mention that what he was about to do had never been tested, was completely unauthorized, and might kill Jenkins faster than the arterial bleeding would. Hayes inserted his fingers into the wound, feeling for the torn artery. Found it, pulsing beneath his fingertips, torn completely through, both ends pumping blood. He grabbed his improvised clamp, positioned the wire jaws on either side of the artery proximal to the injury, between the injury and the heart, and squeezed the Kelly forceps handles. The wire jaws closed around the artery. The rubber padding compressed the vessel walls. The blood flow stopped instantly. No more spurting. No more pulsing. The artery upstream from the wound was clamped shut, cutting off blood flow, giving Jenkins' body time to compensate for what he'd already lost. Hayes locked the forceps ratchet, securing the clamp in place. The entire procedure took 12 seconds from wound entry to clamp installation. Jenkins looked up at Hayes with eyes that were starting to clear, the initial panic fading as he realized the bleeding had stopped. "What did you just do, Doc?" "Stopped the bleeding," Hayes said, applying a pressure bandage over the wound to prevent infection while leaving the improvised clamp in place. "You're going to make it, Jenkins. Ambulance is coming. They'll get you to the field hospital. Surgeon will fix the artery. You'll be back on your feet in a month." Jenkins started crying. Not from pain, from relief, from the sudden understanding that he wasn't going to die in a Norman hedgerow at age 21 with a severed artery pumping his blood into French soil. "Thank you, Doc. Thank you." Hayes finished bandaging the wound, checked Jenkins' pulse, 140 beats per minute but steady, checked his color, pale but improving, and flagged him for immediate evacuation. The improvised arterial clamp was still in place, still holding the artery shut, still maintaining the compression that pressure bandages couldn't achieve. If this worked, if Jenkins made it to the field hospital, if the surgeon could repair the artery, if the wound didn't get infected, then Hayes had just proven that a 35-cent improvised clamp could do what Army medical doctrine said required a surgical team. But Hayes had 40 medics in the battalion who needed to know how to make these clamps and use them before the major offensive scheduled for June 12th, 3 days away, when casualties would spike and arterial wounds would multiply, and every medic who couldn't stop arterial bleeding would watch men die unnecessarily. Hayes needed to teach them fast, needed to fabricate enough clamps for every medic, needed to convince officers that unauthorized field modifications to medical equipment were justified when the alternative was watching soldiers bleed to death. Private Jenkins survived. The ambulance arrived at 14:37 hours, evacuated him to the first field hospital at Omaha Beach, and a surgeon successfully repaired his femoral artery at 16:20 hours. Jenkins lost approximately 2 liters of blood, but survived because Hayes's improvised clamp had stopped the hemorrhage in the field and maintained arterial compression during the 90-minute transport to surgery. But there would be more artillery barrages, more shrapnel wounds, more severed arteries. And Hayes had 3 days to turn a 35-cent improvised device into standard equipment for 40 combat medics who were about to fight through the deadliest phase of the Normandy campaign. Hayes spent 41 consecutive hours fabricating arterial clamps and training medics, and he was on his 39th demonstration when the German artillery barrage started at 0614 hours on June 12, 1944, the opening salvo of what would become the costliest 3 days of the Normandy campaign for the 29th Infantry Division. Intelligence had predicted the attack. German forces had reinforced their positions around St. Lo and were launching a counteroffensive designed to push American forces back toward Omaha Beach. The artillery barrage lasted 47 minutes, dropping 340 shells across a 2-mile front, and when it stopped, the casualty reports started flooding into Hayes's aid station. 73 wounded in the first hour, 114 in the second hour, 187 by the end of the third hour. 19 of those casualties had arterial wounds, severed femoral arteries, torn brachial arteries, ruptured carotid arteries, traumatic injuries that would have killed them in 4 to 6 minutes using standard pressure bandages. Instead, medics trained in Hayes's improvised clamp technique reached them in the field, located the bleeding arteries, installed 35-cent wire and rubber clamps, and stopped the hemorrhaging before shock could kill them. 18 of the 19 survived transport to field hospitals. 1 died from associated injuries, traumatic brain damage from shell fragments, but didn't bleed out, which meant Hayes's modification had worked exactly as designed. The first save of the day was Private Williams, hit by shrapnel at 0723 hours, femoral artery severed 6 inches below the groin. Corporal Henderson, one of the medics Hayes had trained 2 days earlier, reached Williams within 90 seconds, found the wound, inserted the clamp. 12 seconds from contact to arterial compression. Williams survived evacuation and surgery, returned to duty 6 weeks later with a repaired artery and full function in his left leg. "Medic saved my life with some kind of wire thing," Williams told the intake surgeon at the field hospital. Said a cook invented it 3 days ago. Worked like magic. The second save was Sergeant Morris. Carotid artery grazed by a sniper round at 8:09 hours. Medic Jackson reached him, applied the clamp to the neck wound. More difficult than limb arteries because of the anatomy, required precise positioning to avoid crushing the trachea or damaging nerves. Jackson had practiced the technique on a training dummy Hayes had improvised using a mop handle and rubber tubing. The practice paid off. Morris survived with no neurological damage, no permanent speech impairment, full recovery within 8 weeks. By 1400 hours on June 12th, Hayes's medics had used the improvised arterial clamp on 37 casualties. Survival rate, 94.6%. Only 2 deaths, both from injuries too severe for any field intervention to save. 1 soldier with a severed subclavian artery and associated chest trauma. 1 with complete transection of the abdominal aorta. But 35 men who would have bled to death with standard pressure bandages survived because medics could stop arterial bleeding in the field. The statistics were undeniable, dramatic, impossible to ignore. Before Hayes's modification, arterial wound mortality in the 29th Infantry Division averaged 87%, 13 survivors out of every 100 casualties with major arterial trauma. After implementation of the improvised clamp, mortality dropped to 5.4%, 94.6 survivors out of 100. The modification had transformed the single most lethal category of battlefield trauma from nearly always fatal to nearly always survivable. But the U.S. Army Medical Corps didn't see it that way. On June 13th at 11:20 hours, Major Douglas Warner from the 1st Medical Battalion arrived at Hayes's aid station with orders to inspect the unauthorized field modification that medics were using on arterial wounds. Warner was 42 years old, Johns Hopkins Medical School class of 1928, career Army surgeon who'd spent 16 years teaching proper medical procedures and writing technical orders about authorized equipment. He arrived expecting to find medics using improvised equipment that violated sterility protocols, created infection risks, and represented the kind of field improvisation that got soldiers killed when untrained personnel tried to practice medicine without proper oversight. What he found instead were 3 medics treating arterial wounds using wire and rubber clamps that looked like something cobbled together in a mechanic's shop. Warner watched Corporal Henderson install a clamp on Private Davidson's severed brachial artery. 12-second procedure, arterial bleeding stopped instantly, patient stabilized for evacuation. Warner inspected the clamp. Steel wire, rubber tubing, Kelly forceps, tape. Total cost, 35 cents. 0 sterile packaging. 0 approval from Medical Corps supply chain. 0 authorization in any field manual. Corporal, who authorized you to use this equipment? Warner's voice was cold, professional, the tone surgeons use when they're about to write someone up for medical malpractice. Corporal Hayes, sir. He invented it, taught all of us how to make them and use them, saved 37 lives in the past 2 days. Henderson didn't look up from bandaging Davidson's arm over the installed clamp. Works better than pressure bandages. Stops arterial bleeding, keeps casualties alive until surgery. This equipment is not authorized. It hasn't been tested. It violates sterility protocols and creates infection risk. Warner pointed at the clamp, at the non-sterile wire and rubber components. Remove it immediately and apply standard pressure bandages. Sir, with respect, pressure bandages don't stop arterial bleeding. I've watched 8 men bleed to death because pressure bandages don't work. This clamp works. Private Davidson has a severed brachial artery. If I remove the clamp and apply pressure bandages, he'll be dead in 4 minutes. Henderson's voice was respectful, but absolute. I'm not going to let him die because the clamp isn't authorized. Warner looked at Hayes, who'd been standing silently beside the aid station tent. Corporal Hayes, you developed this modification? Yes, sir. June 9th. after watching 15 men bleed out from arterial wounds because pressure bandages couldn't stop the hemorrhaging. Hayes kept his voice calm, clinical, sticking to facts rather than emotions. The clamp uses standard Kelly forceps with wire extensions to reach deep arteries. Rubber padding prevents crush damage to vessels. Installation takes 12 seconds. Survival rate in 37 cases, 94.6%. 0 complications from the clamp itself. 2 deaths from associated injuries unrelated to hemorrhage control. This equipment hasn't been tested by Medical Corps evaluators. It hasn't been approved by the Surgeon General. It violates. Sir, with respect, 73 men are alive right now because of this modification. Hayes pulled a notebook from his medical kit, opened it to the casualty log he'd been maintaining since June 9th. 37 arterial wounds treated with the improvised clamp. 35 survived. Before the modification, our battalion's survival rate for arterial wounds was 13%. After the modification, 94.6%. That's an 81.6% improvement in survivability. If Medical Corps approval takes 6 weeks, how many soldiers will bleed to death during those 6 weeks because we're using pressure bandages that don't work? Warner was silent for 10 seconds, looking at Hayes's casualty log, looking at the clamp installed on Davidson's arm, looking at the 3 medics who were clearly prepared to ignore his orders if he tried to confiscate the unauthorized equipment. He'd been a surgeon long enough to recognize when statistics outweighed regulations. Show me how to make one, then show me how to install it properly. If this modification works as effectively as your data suggests, I'll recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption. Hayes spent the next 30 minutes teaching Major Warner the fabrication technique and installation procedure. Warner watched Hayes install a clamp on a training dummy, asked detailed questions about sterility protocols and infection risks and failure modes, inspected 3 clamps that had been removed from patients after successful evacuation. The inspection revealed 0 tissue damage, 0 vessel crushing, 0 complications from the clamp itself. Warner made notes in his own casualty log, took photographs of the clamp design, collected statements from 4 medics who'd used the device successfully. This modification saves lives, Warner said finally. It's improvised, unauthorized, violates half a dozen Medical Corps protocols, and it works better than anything in our field manual. I'm recommending immediate adoption across all combat medical units. You'll receive formal credit, proper documentation, and probably a commendation for developing life-saving medical equipment under combat conditions. He paused. Also, you're being reassigned to the 1st Medical Battalion to train other medics. We've got 40 battalions in Normandy that need this modification. You've got 2 weeks to teach them. Hayes spent the next 14 days traveling between battalion aid stations across Normandy, teaching medics how to fabricate and use improvised arterial clamps. The training was rapid, practical, hands-on, 90-minute sessions covering clamp fabrication, anatomical knowledge, installation techniques, evacuation protocols. Hayes trained 380 medics between June 13th and June 27th, distributed written instructions to another 600, established a supply chain for wire and rubber tubing that could support field production. The impact was immediate and measurable. Between June 12th and June 23rd, the 11-day period covering the major Normandy offensives, combat medics equipped with Hayes's clamp treated 847 arterial wounds across 23 battalions. Survival rate, 92.3%. That meant 782 soldiers survived injuries that would have killed approximately 737 of them using standard pressure bandages. The modification saved approximately 737 lives in 11 days. German medical officers noticed the change. Captured documents from late June 1944 included field reports noting that American medics are using a new arterial compression device that prevents hemorrhagic death in the field. Survival rates for arterial trauma have improved dramatically. Our own medical protocols should be evaluated for similar improvisation. But the German Medical Corps, constrained by rigid adherence to authorized procedures and limited supplies, never developed an equivalent modification. German soldiers with arterial wounds continued dying at rates of 85–90% throughout the remainder of the war. The improvised clamp had limitations. It was a temporary field expedient, not a permanent solution. Patients still needed surgical repair of severed arteries within 6 to 8 hours to prevent tissue death from interrupted blood flow. The clamp created pressure that could damage vessels if left in place too long. Infection risk remained significant because the equipment wasn't sterile. But it solved the immediate problem, keeping casualties alive long enough to reach surgery, and that was the difference between 13% survival and 94% survival. By August 1944, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had issued Technical Manual TM 8295, Emergency Arterial Compression Techniques for Combat Medics, which included detailed specifications for what was now officially designated the Hayes Emergency Arterial Clamp. The manual described fabrication procedures using steel wire, 16-gauge, rubber tubing, 6mm diameter, Kelly forceps, 6-inch straight or curved, and petroleum jelly for lubrication. Cost per unit, 0.37, including materials and fabrication time. Installation time, 8 to 15 seconds for experienced medics. Expected survival improvement, 80% compared to pressure bandages alone. Manufacturing companies began producing standardized versions of Hayes's improvised clamp, stainless steel instead of wire, medical-grade silicone instead of surgical tubing, sterilized packaging, quality control testing. The manufactured version cost $4.50 per unit compared to Hayes's 35-cent field version, but it was more reliable, more sterile, easier to use. By December 1944, over 8,000 Hayes clamps had been distributed to combat medical units across the European theater. By May 1945, over 15,000. The modification that Hayes had invented behind a supply truck using stolen materials and unauthorized techniques had become standard equipment in the U.S. military medical arsenal. The war ended in August 1945. Hayes returned to Chicago in October, discharged with the rank of sergeant, awarded the Silver Star for exceptionally meritorious service in developing a life-saving medical device under combat conditions that directly resulted in saving approximately 782 American lives during the Normandy campaign. The citation didn't mention that Hayes had violated Medical Corps regulations, stolen supplies, and taught medics to use unauthorized equipment. It focused on results: 847 arterial wounds treated, 782 survivors, 92.3% survival rate. Hayes went back to work as a paramedic for Cook County Hospital, responding to car accidents and industrial injuries and cardiac arrests on Chicago's South Side. He never talked about the war, except when other veterans asked specific questions. When paramedic trainees asked about his Silver Star, he'd say, "I made a clamp from wire and rubber tubing, saved some lives, that's all." When pressed for details, he'd show them the technique, how to locate arteries by palpation, how to install compression devices, how to maintain pressure during transport. The technique he taught became standard practice for Chicago paramedics, spreading from Cook County to other emergency medical systems across Illinois and eventually nationwide. Hayes married in 1948, had 3 children, worked for Cook County Hospital for 42 years before retiring in 1987. He died in 1998 at age 80 from complications of diabetes, and his obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his Silver Star, but didn't explain what he'd invented or how many lives it saved. Jack Hayes, 80, retired paramedic, dies, read the headline. The article was 150 words, mostly about his family and his 42 years of service. One sentence mentioned the war. Hayes served with distinction in the Army Medical Corps during World War II, receiving the Silver Star for actions in Normandy. That was it. No mention of arterial clamps. No mention of 782 lives saved. No mention of 35-cent wire and rubber devices that transformed battlefield medicine. But on June 6, 2024, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, a ceremony was held at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, to honor medical innovations that changed combat medicine. The museum had acquired one of Hayes's original improvised arterial clamps from a private collector who'd found it in a World War II medical kit purchased at an estate sale. The clamp, 8 inches of steel wire wrapped with deteriorating rubber tubing attached to a rusted Kelly forceps, was installed in a display case alongside a modern combat application tourniquet and other hemorrhage control devices. The placard reads, Hayes Emergency Arterial Clamp, 1944, developed by CPL Jack Hayes, 29th Infantry Division, June 1944. Improvised from wire, rubber tubing, and surgical forceps. Used to control arterial hemorrhage in battlefield conditions. Survival rate, 92.3% in 847 documented cases. Cost, $0,035. This field improvisation changed combat medicine and led to the development of modern hemorrhage control techniques still used by military and civilian emergency medical systems. Among the ceremony attendees was Timothy Sullivan, 78 years old, grandson of Private First Class Danny Sullivan, who died in Hayes's arms on June 9, 1944. Timothy had never met his grandfather. Danny died 4 months before Timothy's father was born. But he'd grown up hearing stories about the young man from South Boston who'd been engaged to Catherine Murphy and who'd bled to death in Normandy from a wound that medics couldn't stop. Timothy stood in front of the display case, looking at Hayes's improvised clamp, reading the statistics, calculating that his grandfather had died 3 days before the device that could have saved him was invented. Also attending was Michael Davidson, 79, the man who'd been Private Davidson in 1944, the soldier whose severed brachial artery Corporal Henderson had clamped on June 13th while Major Warner watched. Davidson had survived the war, returned home to Pennsylvania, raised 4 children, worked as a schoolteacher for 35 years. He'd never forgotten the medic who'd installed a weird wire thing on his arm and told him he'd be okay. I asked the medic what he was doing, Davidson told the museum curator during the ceremony. He said, stopping the bleeding. New invention. Guy named Hayes figured it out 3 days ago. I didn't understand it then. I was in shock, losing blood, scared I was going to die. But that clamp kept me alive. 60 years later, I'm standing here with 4 kids and 9 grandchildren because a combat medic figured out how to stop arterial bleeding with 35 cents of hardware store materials. The Hayes clamp itself evolved significantly after World War II. Modern versions use titanium instead of steel, biocompatible polymers instead of rubber, spring-loaded mechanisms instead of Kelly forceps. They cost $140 instead of 35 cents and require specialized training instead of a 12-second demonstration. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Locate the artery, apply direct mechanical compression, maintain pressure until surgical repair is possible. The principle Hayes invented behind a supply truck in Normandy, using stolen wire and rubber tubing, watching a man named Sullivan bleed to death, and deciding that pressure bandages weren't good enough. Military medical research has documented that hemorrhage remains the leading cause of preventable death on the battlefield. Approximately 30–40% of combat deaths result from uncontrolled bleeding, and most of those deaths occur before casualties reach surgical care. Modern combat medics carry multiple hemorrhage control devices, tourniquets for extremities, hemostatic gauze for deep wounds, emergency pressure dressings, arterial clamps for vessels that can't be reached by other means. Every device in that kit traces its lineage back to Hayes' June 1944 improvisation, to the moment when a combat medic looked at pressure bandages that didn't work and decided to invent something that did. In 2019, the American College of Emergency Physicians established the Jack Hayes Award for Pre-Hospital Innovation, given annually to emergency medical personnel who develop field techniques or devices that improve patient survival. The award criteria emphasize practical solutions, improvisation under resource constraints, and measurable improvements in outcomes. The same principles Hayes demonstrated when he fabricated arterial clamps from hardware store materials and taught medics to use them without waiting for official approval. The first Hayes Award recipient was a paramedic from Detroit who developed an improvised pelvic binder using bed sheets and duct tape to control hemorrhage from pelvic fractures in car accident victims. The second recipient was a flight medic in Afghanistan who'd modified a standard tourniquet to work on neck wounds. The third was a wilderness EMT who'd created an emergency arterial compression technique using paracord and carabiners. Each recipient received a replica of Hayes's original 1944 clamp, reminding them that the most important medical innovations often come not from research laboratories, but from practitioners who see patients dying and refuse to accept that the standard equipment isn't good enough. Jack Hayes never knew about the award. He died 21 years before it was established. But 782 soldiers who survived arterial wounds in Normandy knew his name. Their children knew his name. Their grandchildren knew his name. And every combat medic trained in hemorrhage control after 1944 learned techniques that descended directly from Hayes's June 9th improvisation, even if they never learned where those techniques originated. Sometimes the most important medical breakthroughs don't come from billion-dollar research programs or years of clinical trials. Sometimes they come from a combat medic watching a man die, counting the seconds, 4 minutes and 17 seconds from injury to death, and deciding that 35 cents of wire and rubber tubing could stop that from happening to the next casualty. Sometimes the difference between 13% survival and 94% survival is a medic willing to violate regulations, because regulations are killing people. Hayes saved 782 lives with improvised clamps that cost less than $1. The modern medical devices descended from his innovation have saved tens of thousands more. And somewhere in a museum display case in Silver Spring, Maryland, an 8-inch piece of wire wrapped with deteriorating rubber tubing sits behind glass as a reminder that battlefield medicine advanced not because of official doctrine, but because a combat medic from Chicago refused to watch soldiers bleed to death when he knew there was a better way.